Despite being hired in 2021, the Falcons' Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot regime actually is starting in 2023. I'll be talking about that with my guest today, Brad Spielberger of PFF, on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. Help us get over 5,000 subscribers by hitting subscribe on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And make sure you check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku or Amazon Fire TV. So, guys, I have a guest today, Brad Spielberger of PFF. He's the salary cap analyst / expert guru over there. And we'll jump right in to the conversation I had with him all about the Atlanta Falcons offseason and why it's really now in 2023 that the Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot regime is truly starting. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are joined by another illustrious guest here with Brad Spielberger, the salary cap analyst / guru / expert over for PFF. He's also a contributor to overthecap.com. He's got a trade chart named after him. I might want to ask you a couple of questions about that towards the end of the episode. But Brad, want to pick your brain on some of the offseason stuff, some of the Falcons salary cap situations, but like just jumping in to the conversation, you know, just share your general thoughts on the Falcons, their 2022 season, you know, what your expectations are for their offseason and potentially this upcoming 2023 season.
Yeah, so, I know fans probably never want to hear this, but realistically, I think they're starting this new regime in 2023. I think the last 2 years were just about clearing the books, turning over the roster, getting younger, adding draft capital, all of those things because they went so hard and pushed and tried to be competitive towards the end of the Matt Ryan situation, which obviously culminated in that trade last year. But I think they came out for it better. And I think not having that last ride with Matt Ryan, which I do think was possible, maybe if he didn't catch wind of some Deshaun Watson conversations and kind of push his way out. I think it may have been a blessing in disguise to a degree. And so now, like I said, I think this is the first year where, the Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith, are really kind of their hands, their imprint on this team, and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, they certainly have a ton of cap space heading into this offseason. And one of the things that I've been discussing quite a bit on Locked On Falcons and building up the hype is the idea that they're going to do all the spending with all this cap space to really upgrade their defense. Do you feel like that's something that the Falcons can realistically pull off this offseason?
I think they are going to spend a bunch, right? They've been so patient. They have not spent much on external free agents. They haven't really had a lot of internal guys to extend either. Again, moving on from guys like Deion Jones as well. So getting away from other players that had those big salaries and whatnot. I mean, I guess in his, situation, they already restructured him. So more of just kind of eating it there. But I think they are going to spend a good amount, maybe on a couple of those marquee guys. But if not, certainly going to add a bunch of depth, a bunch of mid-tier players, because, the pressure's on now, right? I say all that I say about Fontenot and Smith. Now it's like, all right, you need to win some games. Your division is really bad and there for the taking. So I think they're going to be one of the more aggressive spenders this offseason. Look, Arthur Blank likes to spend money and wants to build a winner for your fans year after year. It's probably why I got a little bit dicey at the end of the prior regime, but that's what he wants. And I think he's going to get that this offseason.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to talk a little bit about some potential targets, some predictions that you guys had at PFF about some of the names that they could be targeting a little bit later in the episode. But I kind of want to talk about kind of the big question mark hanging over the Falcons is what do they do at the quarterback position? And I kind of want to pick your brain on sort of where do you kind of land on this conversation, whether it's sticking with Desmond Ridder or making a big splash for Lamar Jackson or potentially going for an option C. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. And guys, I want to tell you about our new partner here on the Locked On Podcast Network. That is, of course, FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. And they have a great app that's safe, secure, super easy to use. And you can use it to bet the point spreads, the money lines, and build parlays for any sport imaginable. Even with the NFL season over, of course, the NBA season is in full swing. And, later this week when, they come back from the All-Star break, I'll build me a nice little parlay where I can bet a little and potentially win a lot. And I like the FanDuel feature of a parlay builder where I can look at various players, over unders, points and rebounds and assists. And I'm eyeing a Mavs Spurs game a little bit later this week where I can build a parlay around Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic. Later this week, I could build a similar one around Trae Young now that he's up from under Nate McMillan's thumb down in Atlanta. And of course, you guys can do so and don't have to worry about it because it's a no sweat first bet for new customers up to $1,000. That means you get bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. So don't miss your chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to fanduel.com/lockedon. That's fanduel.com/lockedon to learn more, make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons here with Brad Spielberger of PFF. And Brad, it's notable to me that most of the people I talk to that cover the Falcons think that they're going to kind of roll with Desmond Ridder this upcoming season. And a lot of people from outside the organization that cover other various teams, whether they think the Falcons will make a big play for Lamar Jackson or they want the Falcons to make a big play for Lamar Jackson, that seems to be kind of the big talking point. And I'm just curious from your perspective, does the Falcons quarterback conversation kind of just boil down to either taking that big swing for Lamar Jackson should he become available in a tag and trade situation with the Baltimore Ravens versus staying the course with Desmond Ridder? Or do you kind of see maybe there's an option C in your mind for the Falcons? Where do you kind of fall on this discourse?
Yeah, so I think there is one option C. So first I'll say, look, I like Desmond Ridder. I think he was a solid prospect. I think we still need to see more from him. And I think he got better as the year went on in his limited play time. I do not think they're going to make a mid-tier move. Like I think let's say they strike out a Lamar Jackson, and then my option C is maybe they're kind of a sleeper to trade up and maybe go to number 3 with Arizona if they fall in love with one of these prospects. But let's say neither of those things happen. I don't think they're going to be in like the Derek Carr, Jimmy Garoppolo, like which I think would be a bad decision. Right? Like either stick with a young guy, let him play it out, save some money, of course, all those things, or make the monster splash. So yeah, I think Lamar is legitimate if he does come available. And I honestly think we're trending towards him, at least the Baltimore Ravens hearing some trade offers, engaging interest, seeing how that plays out. So that's one. And then, yeah, like I said, if they do happen to fall in love with someone sitting at number 8 right now, maybe they're willing to move up, and go get a guy. But I would say, I wouldn't be shocked if Ridder is the starter week 1 next year. I know there's a lot of, rumors, all that floating around, but I'm sure it's a realistic possibility.
Now, I feel like, given that you're the salary cap analyst for PFF, you're kind of the perfect person to ask this question about sort of what do you feel like for a team, whether it's the Ravens, whether it's the Falcons or anybody else, any team that does wind up acquiring Lamar Jackson this offseason, and potentially giving him the reported $250 million guarantee contract that he wants. What do you sort of think their cap situation is going to be like in the future? Is there a current team in the NFL that they could potentially model that situation? I know the Chiefs, when they gave the Patrick Mahomes contract, they kind of built in a way where they can kind of restructure that deal as they go to free up cap space. Is that a way that they can go? Or is there another one of these big contracts like the Russell Wilson situation or Kyler Murray situation that you feel like is more likely to be kind of the way forward for any team that has Lamar Jackson? I'm just curious, how do you think a team can navigate that situation successfully?
Yeah, so if he does get the fully guaranteed money that he wants, in the Deshaun Watson range, and we should point out Watson's at 230 million. The next highest fully guaranteed at signing ever is 101.5 million for Aaron Rodgers. So he more than doubles that number. If we are operating from the construct of Jackson gets that deal, there's only one other situation you can look to emulate. And what Cleveland has done is just put option bonuses and all these things in their deals. So they can always just push cap down the line on a lot of their players. Myles Garrett has 2 option bonuses in his deal, and so on and so forth. So if he doesn't get that deal, but just gets, a standard top of market, really good contract, like a Josh Allen, like a Patrick Mahomes, Kyler Murray, so on and so forth, you still do have those triggers. You want to be able to maybe have some roster bonuses like the Chiefs have with Patrick Mahomes. Josh Allen also has those 2 option bonuses I mentioned. So long answer short is just you provide yourself with short-term flexibility to push cap down into the future so you can add more talent and spend in the short term. And any team that brings him aboard would obviously want to do that, build around him, bring him some weapons or build out the defense, whatever the case may be. And that's how they would go about it.
Yeah. You would definitely have to build in a lot of cap flexibility just because, again, in this hypothetical situation, if you're bringing him from Baltimore, you probably have to give up a lot of draft assets. And so therefore you're probably not going to be able to rely on the draft to build, and you're going to have to rely heavily on free agency. And, obviously that is always a questionable formula in today's NFL. I'm just curious, do you feel like that's changing, or is it still a build through the draft type of league, or do you feel like there's a way that NFL teams can kind of navigate trying to strike a balance between free agency and the draft?
At the end of the day, draft and develop is the way to be a consistently, sustainably successful team in the NFL. But there have been some, interesting ways to go about it. The Patriots, I think, kind of made it famous, like signing a ton of players to still not really big deals, but like $1 to $2 million deals, right? So instead of just draft picks or spending big in free agency, they brought along a bunch of guys in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 million per year. And it built out their depth. They had, they were able to be matchup specific and do different things because they had a lot of players they trusted and relied on, instead of trying to bring a rookie along and maybe he's not quite there yet. They don't have faith in his play. So, but again, like if you're trying to build through free agency, as in, bringing a bunch of the top guys on the market, that's going to fail more often than not. I know everyone points to the Jaguars now this past offseason. They've tried that 10 times in a row, and it finally worked once. It's not like it's some strategy that has worked for them in the past. It's usually been disastrous.
Yeah. I certainly watching the Tampa Bay Buccaneers do it year after year for many years, over the last decade, and then it finally worked when they got Tom Brady, and yeah, it does feel like it's not necessarily a winning strategy. But we'll talk about building through free agency a little bit, because you and Arjun Menon had an article predicting some of the landing spots for some of PFF's top 50 free agents, and we'll talk about some of those predictions, including a certain Jessie Bates, who's been a very popular subject here on Locked On Falcons over the last week as a potential Falcons target. And we'll talk about that with Brad Spielberger here as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, of course, guys, there's more to come on today's episode, and I thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Why not for your second listen? Check out the Locked On Hawks podcast, where Brad Rowland is giving you the lowdown and the reaction to the firing of Nate McMillan, the Hawks head coach, and talking about what's next. And of course, you can subscribe to Locked On Hawks on the same podcast platforms that you are currently watching and or listening Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So, as I said earlier, you and Arjun Menon recently collaborated on an article predicting some of the landing spots for PFF's top 50 free agents. And that included predicting the Falcons would sign the number 4 free agent in Cincinnati Bengals safety Jessie Bates, the number 31 free agent in Cleveland Browns defensive end Jadeveon Clowney, and re-signing the number 38 offensive tackle in Kaleb McGary, and 2 former Saints front guys that we've been talking about a lot here on Locked On Falcons since the hiring of Ryan Nielsen as the Falcons defensive coordinator, were Marcus Davenport, who's ranked 21. You had him signing with Kansas City, and David Onyemata, number 47, signing with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I'm just curious, sort of, how does that process come about, making some of these predictions, and sort of any additional insight that you want to provide in those predictions?
So the Nielsen one is interesting because Ryan Nielsen, the new defensive coordinator, coming over from the Saints, they courted Jadeveon Clowney a ton, and definitely had extensive conversations, almost signed him in the past. So I'm sure he has some familiarity with Ryan Nielsen, but I do think it's worth keeping an eye on Davenport and on Yamada. I'll say Arjun happened to do those two. So, I'm not sure what his process was to get there, but, they obviously need to add along the defensive line, add edge rusher, of course, and then maybe getting someone to play opposite Grady Jarrett on the interior as well. So, you do look for those connections. You look for coaching connections, all those things. We have kind of a master chart of movement of coaches and for even front office people as well. Obviously, Terry Fontenot also has the Saints connection. Arthur Smith from Tennessee. I think I mocked DeMarcus Walker, the edge rusher in the past to the Falcons. Obviously, different sides of the ball, but that is a factor. And then it's also just how much cap space do you have? Where are the weaknesses on your roster? And lastly, where is your draft capital currently standing? And maybe what are the positions we think are going to, align with your draft picks? And then, what doesn't work, we then say, all right, we'll address that in free agency to get a more immediate fix. And they'll build towards the future and add some prospects at the other positions that maybe line up well, maybe tackle, for example, in this year's draft class, things of that nature.
So it's not just throwing darts at a board from what I
I promise it's not.
Okay. A lot of analysis. I wouldn't expect anything else from PFF. But, talking about some of those moves like Jessie Bates, Jadeveon Clowney, being able to keep Kaleb McGary, do you feel like these are the types of moves that we were talking about earlier that the Falcons could make, adding some, big time names and some of the top free agents this offseason, especially to really kind of revamp this defense?
I do think it's very fun. That's pour cold water, but I saw the tweets and the video of Jessie Bates hanging out with a bunch of Falcons in Atlanta. A, his agent reps all those guys, and B, he's based in Atlanta. So, hey, it's not, I don't break out the celebratory cake yet. But I do think it's very possible. I think, like you said, they're probably going to a degree, prioritize the defensive side of the ball because they need more immediate fixes there, in my opinion, right? Like, you have some young core pieces on offense that maybe you can, add in the draft and kind of, make sure you continue to build out there. But you want to maybe potentially get guys you can plug and play as starters right away on the defensive side of the ball. Bates, I think, is going to get a solid deal, but not, Derwin James, Minkah Fitzpatrick level money, a good contract. And you know, Terry Fontenot in New Orleans, they've prioritized the safety position a ton over his entire tenure. Obviously, drafts Richie Grant pretty early in the draft as well. So, I think it does make sense. And then McGary, it's interesting. He obviously had his best year, but they did decline that fifth-year option. I think that's going to be an interesting one because, as I'm sure we'll get into, Chris Lindstrom's going to get a monstrous contract. And so I don't know if they want to pay him and McGary with Jake Matthews already paid, so on and so forth.
Well, you mentioned Chris Lindstrom, and I've been asked this question before. People ask me, how much money do you think Lindstrom's going to get on the market? I guess I'll ask you that question, Brad. Do you have a sort of projection for what you think Chris Lindstrom could get on an extension this offseason?
So Quentin Nelson just got 4 years, $80 million, highest paid guard at $20 million per year. The next highest guy is Brandon Sheriff at $16.5 million per year, and he's at the right guard spot. Lindstrom will land in between those two numbers. I'd be surprised if it's below $18 million a year. Historically, the right guards have gotten paid a little more. I think some of those things are kind of fading away in today's NFL. The same was the case with tackle spots, and right tackle has caught up to a degree with left tackle. But yeah, I would say, it could be 5 years, $95 million, $19 million per year, something in that range. We obviously, he was like the highest graded player in the entire NFL for us this year. Got some recognition, Pro Bowl or All Pro or both, I forget. So I think it's going to be a really, really big contract.
Yeah. I've been throwing out 18 as kind of the number. So I feel like in the same rough ballpark. I'm curious, ask you a little bit about McGary, but I do want to touch upon Clowney. And, the last couple of years, Clowney has signed a whole bunch of 1-year contracts. I recently did an episode talking about the possibility of signing Marcus Davenport, given his injury history, that he might have to kind of follow into that same boat as a sort of 1-year contract. Do you kind of foresee those kind of 1-year prove it type of deals for both of those guys this offseason, given their injury background and maybe the lack of elite sack production?
I think Clowney at this point, in the beginning, I think he was trying to buy himself time to then get that multi-year deal and say, hey, the value is not where I want it to be, so I'm not going to sign a multi-year contract that has control over me. Now I think he just wants to do that, right? Just wants to play year to year, be able to pick where he gets to go. I mean, it worked out this past season. He obviously basically told Cleveland, I don't want to play here anymore before the season even ended. And so it's a good thing that he was on a one-year contract. So with Davenport, I did actually project him on our projections with a one-year deal because the injuries make it tough, right? Where he is a really, really good player, in all facets, is like top 15 for us, top 10 in pass rush win rate and pressure percentage over his first 4 seasons in the NFL or first 5 seasons. But yeah, he's never played 600 snaps in a season. None of the injuries have been like terrible ligament tears, anything like that, but there's always something. And so I wonder if it's hard for him to find a team that will give him the multi-year deal that he believes he deserves. And again, that's how you end up in okay, I'll take the 1-year prove-it deal. If I get that sack production, like you mentioned, some of the flashier stats, or I play 850 snaps, then someone's going to give me, the 3-4 year deal that I think is commensurate with my play. So yeah, I expect that for both guys. Davenport, because it's a weak class in free agency at edge defender, maybe someone does just say, hey, we'll take the risk and go there. Clowney, I'd be surprised if he signs a multi-year deal.
Now, I do want to ask about sort of Kaleb McGary's valuation. I can't recall exactly what the number that you guys at PFF put on his contract projection. I figure, I'll just say I figure that Jack Conklin deal, 15 million years, is around the area, maybe a little bit below that number. Where do you kind of see Kaleb McGary's projection coming in?
That's exactly where we had it. So I think it was either 14 and a quarter or $14.5 million per year. Obviously Conklin was 15. So, I think it's right below. When you get into, looking at contracts for players, it's not just about overall grades or overall stats and all that. Of course, it comes down to the actual facets that they excel in. And look, McGary had a phenomenal season. I do think he took massive strides as a pass protector, but still, him taking massive strides as a pass protector got him to like above average as a pass protector. Or yes, he's one of the best run blockers at tackle, maybe in the NFL. Obviously, for us last year, he was graded in that manner. But so that's going to keep it down for me, is that he's, 28, whatever years old, and he still is, a league average or slightly above average protector, pass protector. So for that reason, just below Conklin, but still, of course, a strong and sizable contract, especially considering, declining the option coming into the year. I'm sure he'll take, he would take that, looking back a year from today.
Okay. Well, Brad, I appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights into the Atlanta Falcons. And my final question is just the football nerd in me that has to ask you about the trade chart. You have a trade chart named after you, the Fitzgerald-Spielberger trade chart over at overthecap.com. I'm just curious, how does that come about? How do you come up with your very own trade chart?
Yeah, so I was interning with the Minnesota Vikings back in 2020 and had some conversations just about how essentially it's still today, and this is still the case, the Jimmy Johnson trade chart is what kind of controls the marketplace. If you're trying to, if you're trying to look at trades and see if Atlanta can do whatever, teams won't admit this, but some will. Like, that's still what they use, right? Is they look at this Jimmy Johnson chart, and if the two sides are close to equal, then the deal will work out for both sides. And this chart was made in 1988, right? It was based on prior trades to that point because teams struggled to kind of come up with values, and they agreed, hey, let's find something we can all kind of point to as a reference point. So for me, I said, how does it make sense that the league is using a chart where the rookie wage scale comes along in 2011 and dramatically changes the contracts for rookies? So why would that not lead to a change in the draft chart, right? Because, 2010 or Matthew Stafford, Sam Bradford signing these huge deals. The next year, Cam Newton gets 4 years, like $24 million. Like, those are dramatically different things. So, but that was kind of the starting point for me on how we're going to build this thing out and base it off of what is the actual performance of these rookie contract players in every pick, kind of average it out, smooth it out a little bit, and then use those performances retroactively to value each pick in the draft.
Okay. All right. Well, Again, football nerd in me is just like, oh, how, sitting there coming up with your own very own trade chart that feels like living the dream, at least to the football nerd in me. But Brad, I really appreciate you sharing your insight into the Falcons and talking trade charts, nerding out with me a little bit here on the podcast. Let the people know, what type of content you got coming their way in the lead up to, the combine next week and free agency over at PFF.
First, thanks for having me. Always happy to talk Falcons and or nerd out whenever. But so you can follow me on Twitter at PFF_Brad, and you can read anything I'm doing at PFF.com. Obviously, mention the top 100 free agents list that has projections for every single player. After the combine, we'll be editing some of those based on what we're hearing from around the league, and then B, pushing it out to 150, maybe even 200 free agents. So keep an eye on that. That's the big thing that's keeping me up at night the next couple of weeks.
All right. Well, I look forward to checking it out. Of course, people can check out Brad on Twitter at PFF_Brad and check out his work there over at PFF.com. Again, Brad, really appreciate you coming on Locked On Falcons.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, guys, that's going to wrap us up here on today's Locked On Falcons. And tomorrow is a free agent Friday where I am going to give you the lowdown on what I would do if I was in Terry Fontenot's shoes as the general manager and able to basically go in and dictate all the offensive free agents that I'm going to sign. We're talking quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, and of course, revamping the offensive line. Check to see if we're going to keep Kaleb McGary on the roster, as we discussed on today's episode with Brad. That's all in store tomorrow on Free Agent Friday. Make Locked On Falcons, of course, your first listen. Check out all the other shows across the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, for your second listens, including Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft with new hosts Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez over at the Draft Network. Check out Locked On Hawks, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs as well. So, guys, keep it locked here. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.